In this episode, you'll discover whether you can add between 5 and 25 watts of power within 3 months.
Feel the grip of the oar handle, smooth yet firm in your hands. Taste the salt of your own sweat and the occasional splash of water. It's all part of the journey. Welcome to another episode of Faster Masters Rowing Radio. Each week, our host, Masters rowing coach Rebecca Caro, dives deep into the world of Masters rowing. Whether you're on the water or in the gym, join us to become a faster master. Let's go rowing.
Well, hello everybody, and welcome back to a very special elongated episode of Faster Masters Rowing Radio. Today, we're going to be meeting two experts who absolutely love rowing as much as I do. One of the things that they're going to be talking about is strength training. And the key thing here is how and whether strength training is going to work for you in your particular circumstance. Please welcome Alex Wolf and Sam Dutney, both of them intensely interested in rowing. Alex, former coach for British rowing, Olympics level strength and conditioning coach. Sam, a state level coach out of Australia, himself a former lightweight rower. Alex is the only one among us who, have you ever even sat in a boat, Alex?
I hold the record for falling out of the boat most times in a single session at the British Rowing Training Centre. So yes, 7 times I've been in a boat, 7 times I've fallen out.
I like it. Sam, you're going to lead us through a discussion with Alex. This all started because the three of us got online because we're working together. We're doing an erg intensive together. If anyone's interested in it, you can pick it up off of the QR code. And we were talking offline about strength training in the context of a roughly 3-month training plan to build people up to doing the indoor rowing season. So Sam, what was it that really sparked your interest in saying, we need to do this in public?
I think Alex has a really interesting take on strength and conditioning in rowing, and coming from outside of it, I think he brings up a perspective. Even though he's been involved for a long time, he has brought a perspective that is perhaps not constrained by traditional views of this is just how things have always been done, and instead viewing, well, what are the ways that we can make this most effective? And that was something he had particularly around the use of machine weights in developing maximal strength. I found was a really interesting perspective and something that goes against the grain of a lot of what's spoken about in strength and conditioning, particularly for rowing. And I was just fascinated to understand more.
Right, let's dive in.
Awesome. Look, Alex, the first thing I just wanted we'll just dive straight into the broader topic, which is something I'm sure you and I already have the same view around, but it is something that I still see a lot within the rowing community. And that is that there are a lot of rowers out there who don't train weights at all and still go very fast at their level. Of course, the most famous of that was probably the Kiwi pair who, whether or not it was strictly true that they did no strength training, famously didn't lift. So the question I want to start with is, does strength training actually matter for rowers?
I have 2 takes on this. One is that not if you frame it as strength training, but if you frame it as the ability to produce large amounts of force quickly, then that is important for rowing. How you get there is very independent. And as you say, what you hear from the Kiwis, and we know about the Danish as well in terms of what they do. But in terms of their lightweight programs back in the 2000s and early 2010s, that they probably didn't do strength training like we would traditionally do it. But what they were able to do was utilize and manipulate the boat to kind of create this high force strength training within the boat itself. The other side of it for me is, for the vast majority of people, and I would say the Kiwi pair and the Danish lightweight program back then were probably outliers, and they were not the norm. And if we're looking at trying to really go after rowing faster and producing more boat speed, then we have to go after the mechanical or the kind of the muscle the muscle mass and the muscles that actually contribute to rowing, and strength training does then become quite critical. And one of the things I often say is that while it won't determine if you'll win a race, it can quickly determine if you'll lose it. If you can't produce enough force and you keep up with it, you will be spat out the back. And lightweight is probably a really great way of seeing it. With all things really being equal, with same average boat weight in terms of its crew, then only small changes in those force characteristics or those strength characteristics manifest themselves quite quickly into multiple points per second.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. And the other, I suppose, something you just touched on there that I'm just really interested to unpick a little bit more is that, you mentioned talking about a rowing context. Does that mean that strength training should be done in a trying to simulate the way in which a rowing race pans out in terms of the number of repetitions and that type of thing, or what's the type of the qualities that you should be trying to develop?
Yeah, and that's probably the most important question you can ask, because strength training means different things to different people. You only got to ask two rowing coaches, or if you work within a program where you have a strength coach and a physiotherapist, how they will describe strength will be entirely different. Now, when I talk about it, I talk about it from its rawest and purest form, which is the development of maximal force or the development of a rate of force. And if we really simply just hone on those two, there are other things that we might want to focus on. But those two things have specific conditions you must have in place to develop maximal force and develop rate of force. And from a maximal force perspective, you have to be working quite close to the muscle's maximal ability to work. So if you end up trying to replicate the rowing race of 2K, and let's say it's 230 to 250 odd strokes, then you will have to bring the weight right down to a load where you can do that, and therefore the muscles not being stressed enough to create the maximal force component of it. So it's really important that we go from we call it an outcome-led approach or an adaptation-focused approach, where if you know what you're trying to change, then your training has to be bound by those conditions for change. And I think often those conditions get lost in translation just under the term strength training. And strength doesn't determine like a characteristic, it's a type of training. So you can't describe what you're trying to achieve by the type of training that you're doing. Same could be said about, when you're talking about developing UT2, it's like, well, UT2 is a type of training. There's a reason why you do it. Why do you do it? The outcome is that UT2 is just the type of training you do to get to it.
Yeah, so what you're suggesting, or what you're saying there, is that the most important factor when it comes to strength training for rowers is not to try and copy the rowing race, but is to actually, if you want to increase your maximum force, you want to increase your rate of force production, is doing training that's actually going to support doing that and getting that result from it, which I think makes it intuitive sense to a lot of people, but it's also something that people can often forget about. One thing I am interested by is, the way in which you develop it, does that change with different levels of ability? Is the same fundamental principles in play whether you're working with someone at your level at an Olympic level, or if someone is operating on a club basis, or is a master's role within a club? And does it change with age? Is the approach you would take to improve maximal force or to improve rate of force production, just to use those phrases you've used, does that change if someone is, say, a high school rower versus if they're a master's rower?
Crudely, in its simplest terms, the conditions don't really change. Like if you're going after maximal force, then you have to put the conditions around it, and that doesn't change. The principles of adaptation don't change. If you want to develop how much force a muscle can produce, you have to apply the same conditions. But then that's where the spectrum of working with juniors right the way through to masters, that's where it does start to change based upon experience and how what they are in terms of their maturation. For young rowers, one of the biggest things for me, I was having this discussion actually this morning, is one of the most important thing that young rowers can do is learn how to express or deliver the maximal force of those muscles. We don't get taught how to do it, and often we go into the gym or we go into the rowing boat and we try and work hard, but may not be actually maximizing or teaching the person to actually maximally apply all the capability of that groups of muscles. And those who played, say, rugby union or rugby league, or even I suppose Aussie rules, where there's kind of a lot of contact and a lot of bracing for big forces, you learn really quickly to maximally recruit all your muscles, turn all the muscles on to take the hit, and that's a skill in itself. And that's nothing to do with how much weight you put on the bar or how much what your training program looks like. It's just learning that actually what the ceiling of what your muscles can do and how quickly you can turn them on and off and apply it at the right time. And I think often that's skill for young athletes. We have these kind of long-term athlete development plans and these kind of fundamental development programs for development athletes, not just rowers. But the one thing they all miss, in my opinion, is they don't allow individuals to practice being really forceful really quickly. And we can do that by partner resisted stuff. So if you lie on the floor and you have a partner lie on top of you and you've got to try and get off of them, like very quickly you learn how to maneuver yourself to get up. And if you don't apply maximal force, you're going to have someone lying on top of you for an awful long time. When you compare that to masters, that one of the things that we also know with masters is that you get to a certain point where there is natural degradation of your cardiovascular system, your neuromuscular system, and these things are natural age-related things that happen. But we can reduce the decay of that, or reduce how quickly that approaches us, or in some cases probably stop it to a certain extent. And strength training is a really, really powerful way of doing that. So from a master's perspective, there's just by doing strength training, we can prolong just our neuromuscular function, and that helps us on a day-to-day basis and helps individuals to be able to kind of tolerate the day-to-day stresses, which when you then start thinking about getting into the boat, if the day-to-day stress is less, and actually you're fresher and fitter to get into the boat. And then there's the other side of it all, which is actually, can you actually make the boat go faster still? Well, yeah, absolutely. You can definitely use strength training to continue to train like you would any other individual who wants to improve performance. And if you use the same principles and the same conditions that are applied to it, then absolutely will support them.
One of the things that I've always thought as a very positive attitude is, my understanding is, if you start strength training at whatever age, the rate of improvement is actually very similar, regardless of whether you're 18 or 70 or 60. It's just you're probably starting from a lower base. And I think that is a point of encouragement for masters who perhaps have never considered lifting at all as a way of improving both their quality of life, but also, as you said, in the boat.
Yeah, and one of the things that I talk about a lot is this idea of habitual capability. And what it really, the simplest term is, like, what are you normally exposed to on a day-to-day basis? Now, if you're a young athlete, then jumping out of trees and so on, you might be putting 2 or 3 times of your body weight load for your legs when you land on the floor. But for a masters rowers, it might just be the running or the rowing, or the steps of the steps that you run up to get to your office, or whatever it might be. And actually, that's one of what your not natural capability is. And the beauty of strength training is you only need to go a little bit above it to create change. So if you're down here or down quite low, then you only need to be a little bit above it, which means actually you've probably got much greater ceiling to get there. Now, if you're up really high, you need something a little bit higher than that. That's why kind of the Pareto principle of 80-20. For most people, you can get an 80% of the benefit with 20% of the work. It's only the reason why athletes train full time in the elite programs is because they have to spend 80% to get that last 20% to really push it on to make these really small gains. The vast majority of us, you're right, like you make these incremental changes regardless of your age, but it only has to be just above what you're capable of doing, and then a little bit more, and then a little bit more.
And something else you've mentioned there that I think, as a coach, I've always viewed as one of the most important elements of strength training is the actual health and I guess injury prevention benefits of training strength, and the robustness that you develop. That one of my favorite sayings is the best form of ability is availability, and certainly that's something that sometimes people have a bit of a fear that, particularly if they've not done strength training before, that it's going to be something that's going to increase their injury risk. Is that the case? If they've not done it before, is introducing it going to put them at a higher risk of injury? And if not, then what is the best way for them to introduce it so that it can be as safe as possible?
Yeah, so it's the most common question you get asked, not just from masters, but from everyone. But from masters' perspective, it absolutely will become a problem if you start here and you try and go straight here. Like you're trying to take 10 steps at once. We go back to that habitual capability. If you take the first step, which is literally in front of you, the risk that you have is no greater than walking out your front door or getting into your car or stepping into the boat for the first time. Like it's not, there's no real, there's an inherent risk that with everything. But in terms of what actually it does, no, there's no actual risk if you do it properly. Conversely, this is the bit it's my kind of pet hate, but working in kind of some of the high performance programs that I have done and going into a load of them across loads of different sports at the moment, they have these things called resilience or robustness training, which is all this really low load kind of movement preparation. And it's like, yeah, we're trying to prevent the guys from sustaining injuries. Like, well, the last time I looked, to prevent an injury, you have to have a force, the ability to produce a force bigger than what you're being exposed to protect yourself. None of this kind of low load stuff has any impact on you whatsoever. It might feel good and it might help, improve the quality of the muscle tissue, but it does absolutely nothing to prevent or give you any degree of real protection. It's only when you start doing proper strength training that you start getting real benefits. And talking about the proper strength training, it's again a little bit more than what you can already do, which changes every time you do more and more of it. So actually, for me, it has probably a much bigger injury risk reduction because your muscles and your kind of musculoskeletal system is stronger than what it ever been before, and therefore just your resilience to be able to deal with slightly awkward steps, or if you get out of a boat slightly awkwardly or getting the 8 above your head, just being a little bit stronger in your back suddenly makes a huge difference in terms of protecting you. And he does, as I said, doesn't need to be very much, but in terms of strength training, I would say it's probably one of the most potent stimuluses we have for our health. And that's, I was trying to buy a domain name the other day, which I was charged $4,500 for, which was exercise is medicine, because fundamentally exercise is medicine. If everybody could be given something that they could do which could stop and reverse most chronic morbidity or cardiovascular disease, exercise and strength training being a main component of that would be the number one things doctors would prescribe you, because the potency of what it can do for you is exponentially more impressive than any prescription or any type of other activity you could do.
I
And I
like
suppose
that.
fundamentally, if you get injured during any activity, whether it's rowing or whether it's in the weights or whatever, it's because you're not strong enough to handle the load that was placed on your body, whether that's lower back injury in rowing or a rib injury or whatever it may be.
Yeah.
So being stronger is going to reduce that risk, because you're going to be better able to handle that load.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd go one step further. It's the only thing that can repair you as well. So how often do you get individuals who injure themselves and they just stop? I'm going to probably get told off for this on Christmas Day, but my sister and brother-in-law are both doctors, and they both do a lot of running, and they both have sort of sore and grotty calf muscles or knees. And they both say, oh, it gets a bit sore, I stop running, and then when it doesn't feel sore anymore, I go running again. So it might be a couple of weeks. And so, well, what's actually happened with the muscle in your calf since you stopping and running? Well, I've just rested it. It's like, well, your muscle is still broken, and the only way to change muscle structure is through strength training. So if you injure a muscle, yes, you do need to rest and recover and make sure there's no pain. The only way to then recover that muscle isn't through recovery, it's through targeted loading. And again, a little bit more than what it can do. As you get injured, your tolerance comes down, so it's just going to be a little bit above that. Now, if you don't do that, and we all know people, and we might love them to bits, but they all go through this repetitive cycle of, oh, I'll stop. And then those cycles that they have where I can get, 8 months of training without an injury and I'll rest for a month, and then that drops down to 7 months and 6 months. And then suddenly you've got these people who can only get 2 or 3 months of training in before they're having to take another 2 months off training. And then there's in this repetitive cycle. And again, this is what I'm saying around the prescriptions and all these other things that you do, is like, actually, if you just loaded it effectively and safely at the point where you're allowed to, you would change it, within weeks.
And of course, we all know that most masters get injured off the water, not on the water. It's bending down and loading the dishwasher. And, for real, your prescription there, Alex, is absolutely perfect for rehabilitation.
Yeah. And my feeling is it's not the easy thing to do, though. So it's a thing that gets left around it. And the worst bit, and we're all guilty of this. I know I'm guilty of this. But I working with some rowers on Monday evening, and I call it the danger zone. It's like, you've come through the injury, you're feeling really healthy, and you're no longer affected by it. And then you're like, well, do I need to carry on doing this? Because actually I'm past it now. Now, my bit is you're in the danger zone because you're going to want to stop. And when you stop, you suddenly increase your fragility again. And actually then, if like for me, it's I have plantar fasciitis on my right foot. And if I stop doing calf raises at least once a week, it takes me 3 weeks before I get plantar fasciitis again. Just by doing, a couple of sets, 2 times 15, once a week, maybe twice a week, it stays away. And it's like, I know that, and I know when I don't do that, and people know this, but we have to stay on top of it. And it does, body weight calf raises aren't particularly difficult, and you can do it while you're making a cup of tea or brushing your teeth or whatever it might be. And that's the bit for me, is like, if you can just put enough in just to keep you above that threshold. We don't need to be up here, we just need to be at a level which is enough for us.
Yeah, and that makes complete sense to me. And one of the things you said there as well was about strength training, if done properly, is going to be able to have these effects, and is safe and is beneficial. In your book, Strength and Conditioning for Rowing, you wrote that if a rower requires maximal knee extension force, then the most effective exercise would not be a back squat or a deadlift. It would most likely be the knee extension or the leg press. Earlier, you described that part of the problem with squats is that or not problem, but problem for building maximal strength, is that the limiting factor is often the stability of the trunk rather than the ability to overload the legs, and that the legs could handle more load than the trunk stability is allowing you to do. And this has led into this quote that I've just had about the most effective exercise not being the squat or the deadlift, but being the knee extension machine or the leg press. So first of all, can you explain what this means for people who maybe aren't familiar with some of this terminology, and then explain how this observation is different to, shall we say, the more established view of strength and conditioning for rowing, or rather the more traditional view of strength and conditioning for rowing?
Yeah. So I'll start with the traditional view of strength training. Traditional view of strength training needs to be barbell exercises because it was freestanding and it was functional. And function was based upon what it looked like, not what it was trying to achieve. Now, if we go back to outcome, what do we need? And we want to develop maximal force or increase the strength of the knee, and we know the knee is a critical driver of the rowing stroke. Then, if we had to choose any exercise which would overload the knee more than any other exercise, that's why we'd probably end up with a leg press or a knee extension, because we can target the load so specifically around the knee, greater than any other exercise out there, really. And a good example of that from squatting versus machine weights, for example, if the knee needs maybe about 2 times body weight. So if you weigh 80 kilos, 160 kilos of load through the knee. For most, this is more, I suppose, national, international level. Senior rowers, not necessarily masters. So we might be saying 1.2 to 1.7 for masters. Then you're still looking at having to be able to squat 1.2 to 1.7 times your body weight to try and get the knee loaded to a point which is similar to that of a knee extension or leg press. And again, on Monday night when I've had this conversation, it's like, well, how many people in this room can actually squat more than they can leg press? It's like, well, no. It's like, well, clearly the leg is not the limiting factor when you're squatting. It's something else. So if you can leg press more than what you can squat, then clearly there's another limiting factor at play, and that for me then becomes things around the lumbar spine and the lumbar spine tolerance. And the old adage of you're not a rower unless you've had a low back injury, and that kind of runs true. I don't think I've ever worked with a rower who hasn't had some type of low back problem. And while I don't think that the weight room is necessarily the area in which you get injured, I do think it's the area which exacerbates existing or previous injuries. Now, the difference between say squatting and rowing is that when you're squatting, the load goes vertically through your spine and it compresses the spine, so you create a large degree of stability around the spine, which is incredibly difficult, particularly when you look at where the bar is placed across the shoulders, and if you draw a straight line as you're going down from where the bar is and where your hip is, that's kind of like if you draw a straight line from there, that would be your lever angle. So every time there's a degree of movement forward, you're making the lever arm even further away from the hip, which we know when we're looking at basic physics, that the further the lever, or the longer the lever arm, the further away it is from its fulcrum, the more load that's going through that part. And the lumbar spine ends up taking the vast majority of the load. So the lumbar spine becomes a limiting factor while squatting, which isn't the case when you're sitting in a rowing boat, because the force is much more horizontal. So you can tolerate a lot more horizontal force through the spine than you can through through the vertical spine, because the stiffening and the bracing of the trunk needs to be so much higher in a squat than is needed in the rowing. So you're not going to get almost like for like with that. So if you can remove the lumbar spine from the back from the exercise, you can properly target the legs to be really forceful, and then you can purposely train the trunk to withstand this new increased load in the strength of the legs, and the trunk can then tolerate it in the manner which it needs to be tolerated within a rowing boat, and you're just not limited by having this vertical load going through your spine the whole time. And for me, it's squatting and deadlifting are a rarity in the squads I work with, because we simply cannot lift heavy enough without compromising the rower in terms of their back health, or they simply can't lift heavy enough to where we need them to be. So we have to find alternatives to do that.
That's really interesting, and I think so. Just to make sure I can clear on what you said, what you're saying is the reason why this is a limiting factor in the squat movement, but not in terms of force that will transfer to the rowing stroke, is because of the mechanical position of the squat with the weight on top of you compressing the spine versus the rowing stroke being horizontal, where there's a lot less of that type of loading. Is that right?
Correct. And the additional point is that when you look at where the hip and the lumbar spine is probably at its heaviest load at the catch, if you have a particularly poor posture at the catch, that's where you're likely to be at heaviest. And probably just when you get into kind of maximal handle force, which is when the blade is near perpendicular to the side of the boat, they're the 2 points where you'd say are probably the heaviest. But when we're looking at the forces are definitely moving horizontally through the individual, which means, and it's almost as a result of the rest of the movement as well. So it's much easier to tolerate.
So if, with that in mind, if you're utilizing machines like the leg press or the leg extension to be able to maximally or to increase the maximal force that you can generate at the knee. How does that transfer over to the boat? How applicable is the extra strength that you can build through that medium? How directly does that transfer to power on the water and ultimately going faster?
Yeah, this is a bit where I call them steps. We have these small steps where we have an awful lot of faith in, and they are small steps forward, and then there are these really big ones which are leaps of faith. Now, where I would go with an awful lot of the strength training work is that we're really clear that there is a relationship between how much peak power you can produce on a 6 to 10 stroke power test on the ergometer. So, effectively, how much force you can produce has a direct relationship to how much power you can produce on these short ergo sprints, which becomes really interesting. And then when you start looking at some of the other characteristics that we're based from some of my own research and research of others, it's really clear that stronger rowers or more powerful rowers are faster rowers. And this goes back to your very first point, Sam, around the Kiwi pair in 2012 not doing strength training, but they were also the most powerful. I'm sure if you then tested them on some of the dry land testing rigs, they would be incredibly gifted on that. And that's where I would go with it. There was a clear relationship with how powerful, how strong you are, to not only your sprints but also your 2K. And interestingly, there's been some fascinating studies in the early 2020s. I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce their name, but it looked at how big your quads were in terms of just the volume size of your quad, and it found that it could explain about 85% of why all rowers would go fast. So just how big your quads were determined how quickly you could row. Obviously, there's a 15% that you couldn't account for, and it was in the study. It was even bigger than what the kind of VO2 max was, and some of the other bits. But it really shows you that the strength qualities are a delivery mechanism of your physiological capability. So you can have the most amazing heart, lungs, and blood vessels, and pumping all the oxygen and nutrients to your working muscles, but ultimately it's the ability of the musculoskeletal system being able to deliver a technical stroke 250 times forcefully, which enables you to express your physiological capability. So you can't have one without the other. You can't be unfit and really strong, and you can't be really fit and not be very strong. You need both. But ultimately, what our evidence shows and what other people's evidence showing is far more important now. And the recent study I co-authored this year, looking at pre and post adolescent rowers, shows that even at that age, how strong you are determines how quick you go. It was almost black and white in some of this research. So it's for me, it's a critical bit. I realise I don't know if I actually answered your question there or not, or that was just me rambling on about some other area. But hopefully that answered the question a bit.
No, it certainly did. And something you said there about the importance of the peak power, and you mentioned the 6 to 10 stroke maximum. Something that I've found from coaching, and part of my background is in exercise science as well, has been that I've used the 7-stroke protocol, and has been to find that while that does not necessarily have a 1-to-1 correlation with a rower's performance, and because there are obviously other factors in place, one of the things I have seen is that increasing it has near a 1-to-1 ratio of improving their performance, assuming that it's not already they're not 100-meter world record holder and can't run a 5K, that unless you're in an extreme scenario like that. While it doesn't on its own predict or directly predict performance, what I have seen has been that the improvement in it can certainly relate almost 1-to-1 to improvement. with a scenario like that, if that's one of the things that we have established research on, and Mike also have a lot of non-published anecdotal research from over 1,000 data points or 1,000 different rowers, is how do you know when the issue or where the opportunity to develop is going to come from improving maximum force versus improving rate of force production?
Yeah, it's a really, really important question, and it's a difficult one to answer without um, some off-water testing. And we often use counter movement jumps using force plates. You can actually our recent study we used the My Jump Lab app, which was a valid and reliable measure of this, so you could actually do it on that as well. But one of the things which becomes really important is the rowing stroke is primarily a concentric action. So when you get into the catch and come to the dry phase, it is primarily the muscle shortening to generate all the force, and then you come from the end of the dry phase through the recovery back to the catch. And traditionally, and I was one of these individuals, we kind of felt that there wasn't really much of this kind of turnaround force or this eccentric force as you come in, because it's so slow in comparison to, say, sprinting in terms of that kind of eccentric portion. It doesn't really have that much of an effect. Well, now we know it does, and it's not like our traditional plyometric based activities. It's much more. It's still a long stretch shortening cycle, which means this bit coming into the catch. If you remove that and you almost do this kind of pause rowing, we know that the power reduces significantly enough to be measurable, and it slows you down. So actually, the catch, sorry, from the end of the drive through the recovery back to the catch has a significant contribution, and that's where I'm talking about from a rate of force perspective, because that contribution has an impact on what you can then do at the drive phase and the catch and back to the end of the drive phase. So we can measure that on dry land, and one of the things we call it is reactive strength index, which basically is how do you control a decelerating force and quickly turn that around into an accelerating force. That's probably about, I'm sure there's biomechanists and physicists who are going to follow me for my poor terminology there, but that's probably the easiest way to describe it. How do you decelerate quickly to then reaccelerate? That then becomes a rate of force problem, not a peak force problem. And when we spoke offline a couple of weeks ago, one of the things I shared was this kind of view of this kind of analogy of swimming, that if you can swim and I can't, and we're both asked to swim across the other side of the pool, your intention and goal is to swim across the other side of the pool. My intention is not to drown. And I think rowing is identical to this in terms of, if you can't turn it around quickly enough, there's something that's stopping you going into the catch aggressively, like braking hard and reaccelerating hard, versus those that can do it. And often it's a skill as much as a physical quality, capability, that if you have to take longer to slow down, you're going to probably work at a lower stroke rate, and secondly, you're probably not getting into a full catch position as stroke rate does start to increase. You'll probably start to have a slightly more extended knee, and you probably get a little bit more from your trunk and arms. Now that for me is not necessarily a purely a physical bit. It is physical, but there's clearly a skill bit. You need to learn how to get into this full catch position at speed and stop and turn it around, which we can definitely help practice on. But then also, if that's kind of like the software of being able to teach you to do that, the hardware are the brakes. It's like, can you turn it on quickly? So when we're looking at force, it's three things really. It's how much, when, and how quickly. And ultimately, when we're talking about the rate of force bit, it's a combination of all three of those things. So obviously we need force which is high enough to create the braking force, but we also need to have it quickly enough and at the right time so that we can stop and turn around. So that's when we know it's probably more of a rate of force problem, when we're seeing these large time frames to turn around the jumping task. So when you go down and then jump back up again, how long it takes you through to do that. And we can quickly see if you're producing enough force and if you're producing the force quick enough. And we can then say, okay, where do we go? My experience also shows that those that have a rate of force problem also have a force problem. They're just not strong enough. And actually, just by working on the force side of it, you naturally improve the rate of force. Rarely, it does happen, but rarely do I see people who have really poor rate of force, but incredibly high maximal force. Normally, they're probably quite average and low rather than being really good and low.
Yeah. So in general, it's rarely going to be the issue that you have. Does it often go both ways? You said you rarely have someone who has lots of strength and poor rate of force production. Do you see people who have thinking potentially around lightweights and that type of thing, where they may actually have quite a high rate of force production, but not as higher level of strength?
Yeah, you do see individuals like that. It's probably more common, but still not as common as as having both being poor. But that's a good problem to have as well, because very quickly you can turn that around, making big changes. Like the rate of force, as I said, there's a skill component and a physical component. Or crudely saying, just producing max force is just get stronger, and like you'll get better.
And I suppose the logical question from there is, how important is raw values or raw strength as opposed to relative strength? Is someone who is 100 kilos versus someone who's 70 kilos, should they actually be needing to create the same amount of force or a similar amount of force in the weights room to develop those qualities, or is it as a function relative to their weight?
I flip flop between my thinking, but so if you'd asked me maybe a year ago, I'd probably have a slightly different view on it now. But ultimately, the reason why we want to be forceful is because we need to generate enough force on the oar handle to move the boat, or propel the boat forward, and therefore the force we have to produce is all about how much simply put, power the boat needs to generate to increase acceleration and boat speed. Now, if you do that from a relative perspective, you would then say, are they producing enough to actually accelerate the boat to the boat speed you need it to? Or is it an absolute score that everybody in the boat, so if you're in a crew boat, then actually you need to generate X amount of force to generate X amount of boat speed? So if boat speed's the end goal, I think where my head is now is probably I would probably lean more to kind of an absolute amount. But that said, we're seeing more and more lightweights being genuinely competitive in heavyweight competitions. I think it was this year at Henley, there was some lightweight crews that were dominating. Now, clearly, then it's not just the force they're producing; it's the way in which that force is being produced. And, if you ever follow UFC, and there's a guy called Colin McGregor in there that talks about that precision beats power every time. And what he's basically saying is like, yeah, you still going to be produce power, but the precision of being able to apply it when it matters most means there's an incredible technical quality which allows you then to kind of propel the boat forward. And I think my experience of working with some of the heavyweights in the men's program at GB, the kind of ethos kind of was you just needed massive specimens of human beings that could just lay down huge amounts of power, and there'll be enough of it sticking to make the boats go fast. And when they did come up against the Kiwi pair, it was incredibly difficult to match the Kiwi pair, who were clearly technically. They're not saying that Hodgie and Pete Reed weren't gifted; they were incredibly gifted. But the way in which Murray and Bond kind of made that boat move wasn't just about force production. It was about force precisely timed at the moment it needed to be timed.
And I
Did I
think
answer the
that's
question again, or was that another
yeah,
one?
no. No, that was really good. Just in terms of the use of the machine weights, obviously this is a bit of a contrarian take, not just in rowing, but in a lot of, I guess, traditional strength and conditioning view around the exercise and so forth, where the squat has, the reputation as being the king of exercise, particularly when they say the squat, people really mean a barbell back squat is specifically what they're talking about. But it has this reputation as being the king of exercises. What is it the case that that's maybe misaligned in general, or is there something about rowing in particular? It could just be that mechanical position we spoke about earlier, but is there something about rowing in particular that makes it not the king of exercises in a rowing context?
I used to think it was a king of exercises, and everybody back squatted because it didn't matter, because it was a king of exercise. And part of that's our education system, that we're taught from a methods-led approach. Now, if you go back a step to what I said at the very beginning about becoming outcome-led. Now, if function is a product of outcome, then we need to find the most functional exercise to achieve our outcome. And I think often we get how do you describe it, misled that everything has to be a barbell exercise, so that suddenly you're forced to think that you have to do a barbell exercise because that's the king. Where actually, if we really, if function really is a product, if function is really a product of outcome, then we need to understand what we're trying to change first. And when you look at the world through that lens of outcome first, and then all exercise is subservient to outcome, then it doesn't matter what sport you're looking at. The back squat may or may not be the most effective exercise. Now, I've been really fortunate. I've worked outside of rowing, in track and field, in BMX and track cycling, and probably 15 other Olympic, Paralympic sports as well. And I've been fortunate enough to work with individuals where their back squats were incredible. So I've worked with a female BMXer who was at the time probably top one or two female bikers in the world at the time, and her back squat was like 180 something for a 69 kilo female. I'm pretty sure a back squat could be utilized to overload uh, hip and knee extensors, which is exactly what it was. But I've also worked with BMXers of similar quality who could only squat 70 or 80 kilos, but then were on 350, 400 on leg presses. So we had to find an alternative way. So from a rowing perspective, if you can utilize these loads on these exercises, I'm not saying they're bad. It's just we just need to change our expectation of what you need to put onto a bar. And my general consensus around this is if you can't body weight back squat 10 reps, then you're probably not utilizing that exercise as effectively as you could, because I guarantee you'll be able to put double that load on a leg press and move it much more effortlessly. So that, for me, it's not the king of exercises is the one that meets your outcome, not what it looks like. And I think that's where we get caught in this trap of like what we're taught, what it looks like, and our perception of function, rather than leading with outcome first, exercise subservient to outcome, and then finding the most effective way to do it. And it might be the back squat, it might be the deadlift. There's one of the rowers I worked with, the British program, had a 230 kilo trap bar deadlift, about 94 kilos. So like lifting some proper load, and I would say that's probably a really useful load. But the other people that could only deadlift 90 kilos, you'd be like, I'm not sure that's necessarily a place you need to be. Or even people squatting 160, 170, and they're weighing 90 odd kilos. I still don't think the load's heavy enough to create an adaptive response, which will be effective enough to change the musculature around the hips and knees. So we have to find an alternative to do it.
Sure. And so for a rower who, let's say that they're a master's rower, and perhaps they're newer to strength training, or they just might not be at that level of strength yet. where, looking at that, the squat, perhaps they can only squat body weight. There's a room for improvement. They know that there's room for improvement in their leg strength, but also you can see that there's weakness in their, the ability of the spine to handle load and their trunk stability and so forth. Then would your recommendation be that they look to utilize machine weights where appropriate to get stronger? How would you also encourage them to build that trunk stability and that ability to handle spinal load? Or is it a case that increasing those, which would allow them to squat heavier, is putting function, or is putting process ahead of outcome?
Yeah. So the first bit would be stepping into a weight room, a gym, or whatever it might be for the first time is daunting. And probably the safest and simplest thing to do is to use machine weights, because one of the things we know is the body doesn't know exercise. It knows it. All it knows is resistance or stress, if we're really going down to it. So it doesn't really matter what that stress is. So as long as we stress the system a little bit more than what you're already doing, you're going to make an improvement, which is why things like circuit training in the early days make massive changes, and then you end up doing the circuit for the next 2 years and you make no difference because there's no progressive overload. For these masters, whereas I would suggest that actually just doing anything in the weight room which allows them to stress themselves above what they already do is enough to start with. Whether that's machine or if you're a competent weightlifter, then weightlifting. From the trunk perspective, the bit one of the things that regardless of where I start with any rowing population, I always go to trunk as like what is your trunk capability or trunk capacity? Can you just withstand consistent loading for 6 to 8 minutes? So we always test prone extension, so hanging off the side of the bench, supine, facing up and left and right. So we get a picture of what their trunk scores are. And therefore we can then start targeting kind of plank or pillar conditioning based work, where it's just position holds and you do 30 seconds of one position, 30 seconds of the next without a rest, and you accumulate 6 minutes of work. And for me, that builds a foundation of work capacity, and we can then have confidence that their trunk can withstand repeated loading at a reasonably long duration. And then we can then start developing some more dynamic work into them. But I always start from a pillar conditioning or plank conditioning perspective first. One, because it's safe. Two, people can do it without any partner. And three, trying to do 6 minutes of work without a rest is quite challenging. And you might not start at 6, you might start at 3 minutes and build up to 6. But effectively, you can quite quickly make rapid gains in that. And then if you want to progress that, then we can start talking about more dynamic work and looking at that. But that's how I tend to compartmentalize. If here's your legs, here's your arms, here's your trunk. And often we get this bit, well, we're developing the trunk while we're squatting. It's like, well, you are, but you're only developing the trunk if your legs can't produce the amount of force needed. So actually, are you not better finding the most effective exercise that does both, even if it's separate exercises? So I tend to compartmentalize them. And the other comment we often get back is, well, it's not functional. It's like, well, function for what, to start with? And the second bit is, most of us are still walking around and walking upstairs and opening doors and getting in and out of boats and this, that, and the other. And it hasn't affected us whether my leg strength has improved because it's a leg press or a step up or a back squat. We just know that we can do all these other tasks. And the strength training is, in a day where we might do an hour of strength training, we'll wait for 16 hours. I can't even do my math. It's less than 10% of our entire work, and it's probably only 6 minutes of actual work on it, and the rest of our life is functional, if we want to use that word. So I'm absolutely certain it has no negative impact because it's such a little amount, but as I said, such a potent stimulus. And why would we purposefully reduce the potency because we're stuck in the ways that barbell is the only way to do this? you're basically saying that exercise selection is more important than the potency that we can offer individuals to create real, lasting, meaningful, life-changing exercise solutions.
And I get the sense listening to that there that that's been a debate or a conversation you've had several times before. One other question on that: if you for masters rowers who potentially they are rowing or training, doing their strength training out of their rowing club, or maybe they've got a setup at home and they don't have access to machines, then where would, for instance, single limb lower body strength exercise, how does that sit? Is the demands on the trunk similar to, just to take a hypothetical, to a barbell split squat compared to a barbell back squat, while still giving more load on the leg compared to a bilateral movement?
Yeah, I suppose there's two questions. What do you do in a boathouse, and the single leg? Can you use single leg over double leg? From a boathouse perspective, it's really difficult if you don't have the equipment. That said, one of the things I have done in some places is partner resisted isometrics, which is where people are resisting you while trying to do some static holds, and your job as the resistor is to try and push them out of that position. And you can do that against immovable objects. We've worked with a tennis player, a top 100 W 100 female on the tour, and she would take straps and bands with her, and they would use that where they had to try and really overload those physical qualities. So you can do it, and you can do it cheaply, and you can do it in a way which is safe. From a single leg perspective, it's not 50-50. So if you can, let's say you can back squat 100, putting 50 kilos on a split squat probably isn't the same load going through the targeted muscle. And I say that based upon some of the, it's a long time ago now in athletics, but we would do a lot of single limb testing on something called isokinetic dynamometry, which is where you sit in the machine and you move your leg at a constant speed, but you're pushing against it at a constant speed. It doesn't matter how hard you push it; it doesn't go any quicker or slower. It just remains at the speed. Then we did a load of jump testing on the force plates and some isometric testing on the force plates, where you can measure power and force. And consistently, from developing to under 23s through to seniors across multiple different sports, we find that what you can produce on a single leg is between 60 and 70% of what you can do on two legs, which seems nuts, doesn't it? Like you can produce 1,000 newtons of force on both legs. You could produce up to 700 newtons on one leg, which kind of seems really counterintuitive. That why can't you do 1,400 at one leg and do each leg and do 700 each, which demonstrates that there's a capability within a single limb to work at a higher intensity. So we often say that if you want to do single limb training, you can reduce the spinal loading, but it's not 50%. It needs to be a bare minimum of 60, but ideally at 70% of what you can do on the bilateral. And so we can definitely do that, and we have done that quite a lot. If you watch the video in one of my death scrolls on Instagram the other night of a group of kids in a university, I think it was university in the US, all split squatting 4 plates, 420, so what's that, 180 kilos of load on the bar at 18 years old, doing a proper split squat, perfect form, like about 180 kilos on the bar, still 180 kilos of load going for the spine. So you still get to the same end point. If your lumbar spine can't tolerate spinal loading, even if you do a single leg and you get really good at it, you start creeping up close to what your spinal tolerance is. That's become, for rowing as a population, I think that's still a challenge. That the lumbar spine is always going to be a limiting factor for them.
Yeah, and I suppose maybe having that 60 to 70% is almost the proof that the trunk is the limiting factor there, and it's the spinal load that's the reason why you're not doing 1,400 in that context rather than 2 times, or 140 rather than 2 times 70. Look, for the last question from me is just that for any of the rowers and the coaches who are listening to this, what would be the number one piece of advice that you would give them about incorporating strength and conditioning training as part of their rowing, either if it's not something that they're currently doing or if it's something that they want to optimize what they're already doing?
If you're not doing it, I cannot stress enough just to do it. The health, forget rowing full stop, just from a health perspective, I would potentially say resistance strength training probably over cardiovascular. As I say, I'm probably going to get shot down by everyone now. It's probably more potent, and you'll be thanking yourself in late into your old age, because you've just got muscle mass and a neuromuscular system that can tolerate day-to-day tasks. And we also know it has a cardiovascular response. Those who are already doing it, I suppose that the consideration is, why are you doing it? Are you doing it for performance or doing it from a health perspective? If you're doing it from performance perspective, the question, the first thing I'd be doing is asking yourself why, or what would you need to do, or what do you need to do to ensure that the load is great enough to create change? And if we talk about habitual capability, is it a little bit more? So, I'd say for most people, you're looking at 1.2 to 1.7 times body weight around the knees and hips. Can you get that with your existing resistance training? Those who are doing it from a health perspective, I would say just continue doing it, because I think I've probably said it a million times now, but the potency is the most important thing, and it's not a secret. But if you carry on doing it, you can reverse an awful lot of musculoskeletal factors very, very quickly just by keeping it going. And we also know, if you are injured or you do have any illness, muscle mass is also a really important factor in recovery as well, in terms of being able to just maintain your general health. So there'll be 3 different route ways, but I think each one of them have slightly different needs.
Fantastic. Well, we started this conversation at 5 a.m. my time, so it was a bit early in the morning to have my worldview challenged, but I'm very glad that you did. So thanks very much, Alex. It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, and from me as well. And for the people who are watching and listening, Alex and Sam together have produced a comprehensive erg training program called Erg Intensive. That's the QR code you can see on the top of the screen. Sam wrote the training program, Alex wrote the weights program. And one of the things that Alex has said is that you can probably gain between 5 and 25 watts of raw strength within that 3 months. And today he's explained in great detail the methods that he uses and how we can all put them into effect in improving our musculoskeletal health, but also we're interested in our rowing. Now, for those of you who are new to Faster Masters, we're all about helping masters enjoy rowing more. We've got a newsletter. It goes to around 7,000 people every week. We'd love if you joined us. And we also really, really thank Sam and Alex for joining us today. It's been marvelous. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
We are part of the RowingChat podcast network. Please tell your fellow rowers about the show. If you've learned just one helpful thing from today's episode, please consider supporting the show for as little as $1 per month by visiting fastermastersrowing.com/podcast.